Of course, it was also easy when I started working with derivatives some 22 years ago. The main agreement I needed to know was this one. This is the 2002 ISDA Master Agreement, and I dealt with its predecessor at that time, the 1992 Master Agreement. And all we had to know was this was the framework agreement covering OTC derivatives under it. The terms were set out in a printed main body and amended through a schedule. Practitioners were able to choose whether English law or New York law applied to it. And, of course, we'd also have to learn about collateral. And for that, we had the Credit Support Annex. And here's one here. It's the CSA. It's governed by English law, which meant it was a title transfer annex, and it would be an annex to the ISDA Master Agreement. And there was also a New York law version of the CSA as well. Here's one here. That would be a security interest document. So just knowing those three agreements inside out, these were your foundation agreements for OTC derivatives. Occasionally, we'd also use the credit support deed. This was a security interest document under English law, and it was rarely used. It was used those special times that margin needed to be segregated. Perhaps it also got some increased popularity after the financial crisis and was used by hedge funds who were segregating margin at their prime broker. But with the margin rules, the amount of documentation which underlies one of these ISDA Master Agreements has become huge. So let's work through how that has expanded. With the 2016 variation margin requirements coming into play, that meant that affected institutions had to put in place, in addition to their credit support annex, which would remain for legacy transactions, they also had to put in place a credit support annex for variation margin, which complied with the VM rules. Now I have one here. Here's a version for English law. There was another version that was done for New York law. So up until initial margin requirements came into force, it was really just this package that derivatives counterparties had to deal with. And that's still the case for any derivatives counterparty that has not come into scope of the initial margin rules. Now, understanding that background and those documents has given the shape to why we have such a variation of documents here. The margin rules came in under a very tight time frame in 2016. So the drafters of the margin documentation thought that the best way to meet that would be to adapt the existing ISDA collateral documentation to make it work with the new initial margin requirements. So that was possible easily with the credit support annex under New York law, because as I mentioned, the New York law CSA is a security interest document. The drafters produced under New York law in 2016, it was released by ISDA, the Phase 1 Credit Support Annex for Initial Margin, the 2016 version. Now, if you run a black line against the New York law CSA, you can see the genesis of it. It's a bigger document, but it has lots of additional provisions to comply with margin requirements. Now, so far so simple. Credit support annex for initial margin. It's based on the CSA everybody's familiar with already, and it's in addition to the variation margin CSA. So a New York law counterparty now has their master agreement, they have the credit support annex for legacy trades, they have a 2016 CSA for VM margin as well, and now our phase 1 counterparty has a CSA for initial margin under New York law. And of course, that's only going to generally be in place where the underlying assets that are being posted are located in the United States. So it is possible to have an CSA under New York law underlying an ISDA under English law, although not hugely common. So as I mentioned, the English law CSA is a title transfer document. Once collateral is posted under an English law CSA, the party that's received that collateral owns it. So it's a title transfer document. Well, that doesn't work for initial margin because the collateral has to be posted and a security interest granted, but it remains in the ownership of the party, the pledgor, who's posted that collateral. So adapting the English law CSA isn't going to work. So instead, what the drafters did for the English law document is they took this, the credit support deed, drafted in the 1990s, rarely used, as I said, and made that work because it was intended to be used with third-party custodians under English law. So we now had a credit support deed that was adapted to become the 2016 Phase 1 credit support deed for initial margin. Now, that so far, so simple. We have a credit support annex version for use in the United States, where collateral is located in the United States. We've got a credit support deed for use of collateral that's located in the UK. So with the tri-party agents, which are based in the UK, such as JP Morgan and BNY Mellon. But there were two other tri-party agents prominent in the market, Euroclear, which is based in Belgium, and Clearstream, which is based in Luxembourg. So the idea of the credit support deed and the credit support annex is that you have a security interest within those documents, and that's where security is taken over the collateral that's posted. So you have a New York law security interest that's within the 2016 ISDA CSA, and you have an English law security interest for assets located in the UK under the credit support deed. So that works where you have a custodian, such as BNY Mellon in the United States, assets located in the United States for the US document. The English law document works for the two tri-party agents, which substantially had their assets held under custody in the UK, BNY Mellon and JP Morgan again. However, there were two other prominent tri-party agents in the initial margin sphere, Euroclear, based in Belgium, and Clearstream, based in Luxembourg. So with the assets of Euroclear that are held in custody being located in Belgium, it no longer worked to have a security interest under English law, because the assets were in Belgium, or under New York law for the same reason. So a variation of the credit support deed and credit support annex was created especially for Euroclear and for Clearstream. So Euroclear and Clearstream's version of the credit support deed and credit support annex is called the Collateral Transfer Agreement. And I have a 2016 version here. It's called the Collateral Transfer Agreement for use with Euroclear Bank collateral management documentation for non-centrally cleared derivatives. I have another version here, the 2016 version of the Collateral Transfer Agreement for use with Clearstream tri-party collateral management services. And the key difference with the English law and the New York law versions is that the security interest is stripped out. And that's because these documents retain English law as the governing law, and they then add in various provisions as well which are specific to Euroclear and Clearstream, and add two additional documents which are the security agreements, which add the security interests under those respective governing laws. So I've got here the 2016 Clearstream Security Agreement, and I've got the 2016 Euroclear Security Agreement. These are governed by the local laws of where the underlying collateral is situated. So in the case of the Clearstream Agreement, it's governed by Luxembourg law. In the case of the Euroclear Security Agreement, it's governed by Belgian law. So that tight timeline of bringing in the IM rules led to adapting those existing documents, the credit support deed, the credit support annex, then bringing about a new agreement to deal with underlying collateral assets being based in other legal systems. That was fine for the Phase 1 dealers and the Phase 2 dealers, the world's largest market-making banks for OTC derivatives. But in Phase 3, which came in September 2017, we saw the first buy-side entity come into scope. So one of the world's leading hedge funds. And this meant that there were some additional tweaks that needed to be made to the margin documentation. One of the key ones is that the large hedge funds already post margin outside of the IM requirements, and it may be something that's more demanding, it may be something for prime brokerage requirements or the other assets that are held. And some of the tweaks that are made in here, and we covered these in some detail in the first episode of Series 1, are designed to take account of that. As the threshold lowers, the range of financial institutions in scope begins to diversify, and in 2017 it included the first buy-side entity. Estimates vary, but with a threshold of 750 billion euros, there may be as many as 70 newly in scope counterparty groups in Phase 4, which commences and comes into force on 1st September 2019. As with earlier phases, the Phase 4 counterparty groups will need to enter into IM-compliant document sets with paired entities in counterparty groups in their own phase and also earlier phases. Phase 5, the final phase coming into effect on 1st September 2020, affects counterparties with a gross notional amount of uncleared OTC derivatives at a measurement point above 8 billion euros. Some estimates place the number of affected counterparty groups as high as 1,200. That meant in 2018 we had a new series of documents came out. So we had a 2018 version of the credit support deed for initial margin, a 2018 version of the credit support annex for initial margin, and we also had new versions of the Euroclear and Clearstream collateral transfer agreements. And in addition, because other custodians were beginning to become involved in initial margin, a generic version of the CTA was produced, in particular taking into account that some of those new custodians may not be based in Belgium, may not be based in Luxembourg, the UK or the US, and so the security interest is stripped out of that document again, it's governed by English law, and separate security agreements could then be added under the governing law of where the collateral assets were located. So we had new forms of the Euroclear Security Agreement, we had new forms of the Clearstream Security Agreement. So these forms introduced, they're able to be taken advantage of by newly in scope counterparties, and it wasn't that the old documents had become obsolete, because many Phase 1, 2 and 3 counterparties were quite happy with the existing set of documents, particularly if they weren't facing a hedge fund. So we have the 26 documents still being used, the 2018 documents are now being used as well. So we've got quite a long way in this episode and most of our episodes without mentioning Brexit. But unfortunately, Brexit has made everything all the more complicated. And the reason for that is because where a custodian is holding the assets of an EU27 counterparty, that now becomes very problematic because of the rules surrounding Brexit. So what the tri-party custodians have done who've held assets in the UK and have been facing EU27 counterparties, they have instead set up hubs within the EU27. So BNY Mellon has established a new hub in Belgium for dealing with EU27 counterparties. JP Morgan has done the same in Luxembourg. And this has required some amendments to the documentation. So we now have a new 2019 generic collateral transfer agreement for initial margin, and that can be used by any custodian. And there are a number of new custodians coming into the market for Phase 5. There'd been estimates, this could be as many as 50 or 60 new custodians. Other figures we've heard it's likely to be 12 to 15, maybe a few more. But those custodians may be holding assets in many different countries. So we have a new generic CTA collateral transfer agreement that can be used alternatively to the credit support deed, where assets are for non-EU 27 clients, and the custodian retains its hub in the UK. And indeed, that's what's happened, where a custodian has also retained a hub in the UK, such as BNY Mellon, and continues to use the credit support deed with those clients. So we have this new set of agreements in 2019. We have a new version of the CTA for Euroclear, a new version of the CTA for Clearstream, a new generic CTA, and it's picking up on some of these Brexit issues there, that assets may be situated in the EU for EU clients. And this has meant that we have a whole new series of security agreements that have come out, because the CTA does not have the security interest within it. The collateral transfer agreement is under English law. The security agreement is under the law of where the assets are held. So we've got all these different drafts of that, and that's what we have here. So I'm looking here, I've got an Irish law version of the security agreement prepared and released by ISDA. I've got a Luxembourg law security agreement released by ISDA. And you might say, don't we already have one of those because we have it for Clearstream? Well, this is a non-Clearstream version. We have a French law version here, and we have a generic Belgian law version here as well. So having gone from that simplicity over here of having just an ISDA master agreement and maybe a credit support annex, we have this plethora of other documents. And if you're a Phase 5 counterparty, depending on the custodian of your counterparty, you could find yourself using any of these documents. It would also depend on the choice of your counterparty as well. It may depend on the number of custodians you are using yourself. So this is the whole range of documents that you could end up having in place as a Phase 5 counterparty as you prepare to meet the initial margin requirements. So what could this mean for Cadiz Group as a Phase 5 counterparty? Let's say Cadiz Group has appointed BNY Mellon as its custodian for its UK subsidiary. Well, that would mean Cadiz Group would enter into a 2018 credit support deed, and there'd be no need for a security agreement because the security interest is set out within the credit support deed. But let's say for one of Cadiz Group's counterparties, that counterparty had appointed Euroclear as its custodian. Well, that would mean that the custodian would enter into a 2019 collateral transfer agreement, and because the assets were situated in Belgium, there would be a Euroclear security agreement under Belgian law. Now, for another counterparty, that counterparty might have appointed Clearstream, and so Cadiz Group would enter into the 2019 collateral transfer agreement for Clearstream, because the collateral is situated in Luxembourg, the Cadiz Group would also enter into a 2019 Clearstream security agreement. Let's say Cadiz Group was facing an EU27 counterparty that had appointed BNY Mellon. Well, then it would also have in place with that counterparty be using the generic 2019 collateral transfer agreement, and it would be using a form of the Belgian law security agreement for initial margin as well. And you can see that there could be various other nuances to that. Cadiz Group might be facing a phase one counterparty that says, thank you very much, we still really like the 2016 documentation, so we're going to enter into that document. So you're going to have a 2016 credit support deed, and the variations then start to spread out as perhaps another counterparty has appointed an Irish law custodian. So we've got the generic phase 5 CTA, we've got an Irish law security agreement as well. So there could be 300 documents or so that, let's assume, across the various counterparty matchings, but amongst those 300 documents you could find a big range of documentation. Now, we've been looking at this today from the credit support deeds to CTA security agreement perspective. We haven't forgotten that there's another level of documentation, which would be the account control agreements and the custody agreements, and those are going to be specific to the particular custodian that's been appointed, and that's something that would be the subject of another episode. And also it's something we covered to a certain extent in episode 1 of series 1. Under the collateral agreement, the chargeor charges the segregated accounts and any collateral in them in favour of the secured party and assigns the chargeor's assigned rights to the secured party. These assigned rights are defined as all present and future rights relating to the collateral which the chargeor has against the securities intermediary or any third party. So that's the ISDA documentation, and we talked about English law and New York law and the local laws for the security agreements. But there are other governing laws available for initial margin, and that's something that Cadiz Group would need to consider. Post or in the run-up to Brexit, ISDA launched a project to create an Irish law ISDA master agreement and a French law ISDA master agreement, and these have been accompanied by credit support documentation under those laws. But also, in addition to ISDA, the German Banking Association has also created German law documentation to support the German law master agreement, and created German law documentation for posting initial margin. So when we were in Frankfurt recently, I sat down with my partner Patrick Scholl, and we discussed the German Banking Association German law template documentation for IM.